Hall. I hope you've got your brain switched on because chapter 15 of this book covers a lot of material. The topic is chords and cadences. It's a really important topic. Now, in the last video, I mentioned that these 6 chords are closely related to one another. And we have names for those relationships. If we say that C is the tonic, that means the home note, do, do, re, mi, re, do. The home note is called the tonic. That's the key we're in. Let's say we're in C. Now G is called the dominant. The chord of G is the dominant chord when you're playing in the key of C. The chord of F is called the subdominant, and I've already mentioned that the chord of A minor is called the relative minor. You might hear it described as the submediant as well, but that's for another chapter. So they're the keys, the chord relationships in the key of C major. Of course, we're not always in the key of C major. If we were in the key of A flat major, there'd be a completely different set of chords, but still with those same relationships. A flat is the tonic, we have a dominant, a subdominant, and a relative minor. Now, back to C major. Here are the chords that are related to C, but written out on the stave and numbered. You'll see that the dominant chord, the G major chord, is number 5. That makes sense because we got it from the cycle of fifths. It turns out that the subdominant chord is chord 4. And we often call it chord 4, rather than calling it the subdominant. It trips off the tongue rather more easily. Now, for grade 5 theory exams, you don't tend to have to take any notice of chord 3 or chord 6. Let's get rid of them for now. So here are my 4 chords, 1, 2, 4, and 5. Sometimes it's helpful to write out a chart like this. Chord 1, C, E, G. Chord 2, D, F, A. Chord 4, F, A, C. And chord 5, G, B, D. I call that a chord table. Here's another chord table, this time in the key of D. Chord 1 is D, F sharp, A. Chord 2 is E, G, B. Chord 4 is G, B, D. And chord 5 is A, C sharp, E. I'm going to add one other thing to this chord table. I'm going to add a y-axis. A little A, a little B, and a little C, which helps us to define chords even more clearly. Take a look at these chords that I've drawn in the key of D. They're not just straightforward triads. I've not made it that easy. We're going to give these chords names. Let's look at this first chord. It's got the notes D, F, and A, with a D as the lowest note, a D in the bass. So looking at my chord table, it's chord 1, the D is in the bass, so it's chord 1A. We often just call it chord 1. Let's take a look at the next chord along. The notes in this chord are D, F, A, with an F sharp in the bass. The lowest note is F sharp. So when I look at my chord table, again it's chord 1, but this time the F sharp is in the bass, so I call it chord 1B. The reason it has a different name is because you move away from 1B in a quite different way than you move away from chord 1. For example, a piece of music will often end on chord 1, but a piece of music will very rarely end on chord 1B. It just doesn't sound so stable. So we call it something different because we treat it differently. Now the next chord, we've got G, B, D with the G in the bass. So that's chord 4. For A if you like, or just chord 4. And the last chord on the right, we've got the notes A, C, and E. The lowest note is E, not the lowest note of the right hand, but the very lowest note of the texture is E, put a ring around that. It's chord 5, reading across, it's chord 5C. Now, a completely different topic, related but different, is the topic of cadences. And cadences are special names that we give to really common chord progressions. A chord progression is one chord, then another. I've already mentioned that we often go from the dominant to the tonic, chord 5 to chord 1. And when a piece of music goes from 5 to 1, it sounds like you've reached your destination. You've won the race, you've finished. It sounds like the end. And we call that a perfect cadence. Now there might be a moment in the music where there's a brief breath, a kind of half stopping point, but it doesn't sound finished. It sounds like you've stopped for a swig of water. And that's called an imperfect cadence. The chord progression will be 1 to 5, or maybe 4 to 5, or maybe 2 to 5. Either way, it will end on chord 5, the dominant. A lot of music has a string of chords going to chord 5, then a quick breath, then a whole string of chords ending 5, 1. The imperfect cadence, and then the perfect cadence. Other cadences you might come across in your playing, and also in grade 5 theory exams, are the plagal cadence, which goes 4 to 1. Again, it sounds like you finished the race, but I've drawn a vicar running this race because the chord progression 4-1 is often set for the word Amen. If you're familiar with hymns and you're familiar with the setting of Amen, you might recognise that sound. Another cadence, 5, you're expecting 5-1, but suddenly you tweak to the relative minor, you go 5-6. It really does sound like you've tripped over. It's an interrupted cadence, and you're expecting the perfect cadence, you're expecting the end of the piece, but something else happens. I'll demonstrate these more clearly at the piano.
At the piano, look through a piece you know. Work out what the chords are and identify each of the cadences. This is the basis of musical analysis and should inform your performance of the piece.
I hope you have a copy of this book, There's More to Playing the Piano, by David Hall. The task at the end of this chapter is to take a piece you know and work out exactly what the chords are, what they would be called in terms of numbers, chord 1, chord 5, chord 4B. Now it might be that you use the sheet music and go through it carefully, looking at all the chords, or what I'm going to do today, a piece I know in my head that I already play, I'm just going to label the chords for you. I'm going to take a hymn tune, Amazing Grace, and I'm playing in the key of C. So the chord of C is chord 1, and that's where we start. Amazing Grace, chord 1B. How sweet, chord 4, the sound, back to chord 1. That saves, still chord 1, a wretch, 1B again, like me, chord 2, going to chord 5, I once, chord 1, was lost, chord 1, but chord 4, now am found, chord 1, now relative minus, chord 6, was blind, but now, chord 5, I see. So it's 1 up to 1B, 2, 4, and 1, and 1B, and 2, 1, 1, 4, 1, 6, 2, 5, 1. Now let's look at the cadences more closely. Now I mentioned earlier that a lot of hymn tunes have plagal cadences, 4-1. 4, 1. Then you take a breath. That's an imperfect cadence, 2 to 5. Then there's another plagal. And then the piece ends with a perfect cadence. There's also the interrupted cadence I mentioned. Have a listen to what it sounds like if I play an interrupted cadence at the end. So after the interrupted cadence, we tend to then finish the piece off properly with a perfect